Today I'm going to show you how to make this fun and easy Christmas tree decoration. Hi, I'm Kim Jamison Hurst of Chatterbox Quilts, and today we're working with the Martelli Easy Peasy Tree Template. Now, this template is usually used to make a stuffed tree, and it's actually a set. It comes with two different templates, as you can see here, one that's quite large and one that's smaller, and it's the smaller one we're going to work with today. So I'm just going to put the large one off to the side. Now, there's a few things that you need to work, or not to work, but to make this project. So let me show you what they are. I did mention the smaller template, so I've got that ready to go. You also need some fabric. Now I suggest you use either wool or wool blend or felt, something that's not going to fray because we're not actually finishing off the edges. There's going to be raw edges on the edge of the Christmas tree decoration. You also need some batting, and I suggest you use a flat batting. I'm using Warm and Natural 100% cotton. You could use an 80-20 blend as well, but don't use any puffy, poly type of batting. That's not going to work. It's going to be too puffy, okay? We don't want that puffy. You're also going to need a rotary cutter, so either your 45mm, if you have a smaller 28 one, that may be helpful as well for cutting out this template. You'll also need something to mark your fabric with. Now I go old school and I like to use a soap sliver when I'm working with dark fabrics, as I am here, so this works very well in this situation. And actually I'm using it more on the template than on the fabric, but it still works well because the template's black. You also need some fabric glue. I'm just using some Aleene's tacky original glue. That works fine because we're going to be putting some trim on this decoration. And speaking of trim, I'm going to be using some metallic rickrack. This is a medium rickrack because the size works well for the size of this decoration. But you could use ribbon if you wanted, or you might just want to use some of the decorative stitches on your sewing machine. I'm going to be doing that as well. You also need something to hang the decoration with, and I'm using this ribbon. Just an 8-inch piece of ribbon will be fine. You could use twine if you wanted, or something else to make that hanging loop. You're also going to be doing some stitching, of course. So I actually have two threads I'm going to be using here. One that matches my fabric, so this is a pretty close match to the wool that I'm using. And the other one is a contrasting one. So I'm going to be using some decorative stitches on here along with the rickrack. So I wanted something that's going to show up against the rickrack. So I thought this kind of yellow color, this is actually a glide called Buttercup, glide thread, polyester thread, called Buttercup is the color. And I thought that would work really well for this project. So I'm using those things. I also need either a tape measure, or I'm going to use my ruler in this case, and a cutting mat, of course, because we're going to be cutting with a rotary cutter. All right, so that's what you need to get started. So let me move these things out of the way and then show you the next step in this process. Now I forgot to tell you where you can get this Easy Peasy tree set, and that's from Martelli Notions. And if you look in the description below, I'll have a link so you can go to their website and find that set for yourself. One of the nice things about the Martelli templates, if you're not familiar with them, is the fact that they have this no-slip backing on them. So when you put them down and you're working on the fabric, it doesn't slip around, which makes it really, really helpful, especially in this case, because we're using this a little differently than what it was meant to be used for. And this is where my ruler comes in handy and my little soap sliver, but not my hanging ribbon, not yet. Okay, so rather than using the whole template and cutting out my fabric from the whole template, I want it to be a little smaller than that, okay? So what I actually did is I took my ruler, and like I said, you could use a measuring tape if you wanted to, and I'm lining up the 2-inch mark along the edge of the template, okay? The straight edge of the template. And then I use my marker, in this case, my soap. Let me just make sure I'm over there properly. And I've just marked it, okay? Just lightly marked it on there, okay? It's not going to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exact. It's just that I don't want to use the whole template. So you could actually use a different measurement if you wanted to, but 2 inches seems to work fairly well. That's what I used for my ornament or decoration. Could be either. All right, so the next thing I want to do, since I've got that marked, is I want to start doing some cutting. So I'm taking my fabric here. Now this is a piece, you can just see it's kind of like a remnant piece. And what I want to do is I want to line this up along one of the vertical lines on my cutting mat. Doesn't matter which one. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm trying to make sure that I get everything as straight as possible when I go to cut. All right. So I'm now going to line up my template. Now remember I marked in 2 inches, and I want that to be along the folded edge of the fabric. Okay. I'm just going to move things over a little bit. I want to make sure I can get this really accurate for me. Okay, so I've changed it. I put along the 20-inch mark. So because it's 2 inches in, my template straight edge should now be on my cutting mat along the 18-inch line. So it's just a double check, okay, to get it as close to perfect as I can be. So perfect-ish, okay? So you notice that I folded my fabric. Maybe you didn't notice. I should tell you, I folded my fabric because this template is only half a tree, as you can see. I need a whole tree. As a matter of fact, I need 2 whole trees. So what I will do is I will use my rotary cutter. And as I said, you can either use a 45mm or sometimes the 28 is easier to get in to cut out one of these pieces. All right. So I'm going to cut out one of those pieces, and then I'm going to take another piece of wool and cut out another one. I cut them out separately because with wool it's a bit thicker. It's just a little easier, I find, to cut them out separately. Once I've done that, I'm going to do the same thing with the batting, okay? So I have different pieces of batting here. Let's see which one is big enough to cut this out of. This one might not be. Let's just see. Oh, yes, it might just work. It's very close. Okay, so I would do the same thing. I'd line up my batting along one of the vertical edges here, line up the edge of my template 2 inches away from that vertical line, okay, and then I can cut it out, okay. Maybe I'm a little short there, but I have a bigger piece here, so I can do that. But just to show you, okay. Now, one thing I wanted to point out to you, when you look at the template, you'll notice there's some cuts into the template. That is because when you get to that area, and if you're wondering what I'm using here, these are the Martelli Ergo cutters as well. Really work very well and easy on your wrist. So again, look in the description below for a link to these if you're interested in these products. So you can kind of get right in there with that 28mm, but you may find that when you're done cutting and you take your template off your fabric, there's still a little pieces that need to be cut with scissors, so just to be mindful of that. That's just because of the angle you're coming in at. Kind of difficult to get in there with the rotary cutter. So some little small embroidery scissors are good to just snip those last little bits off. So once you've cut out 2 pieces from your wool and 1 piece from your batting, the next thing you want to do is you're going to layer them, and you're going to layer them like you do with a quilt. So you're going to have a piece of fabric on the bottom, batting, and then another piece of fabric on the top. So let me show you what that looks like. All right, so I've got my back piece here. Here's my batting. Okay, and you're going to line that up as well as you can. Again, these might not be perfect. That's totally fine. Just line them up as best you can. We're going to do a little trimming later, so not to worry. This is a no stress project. And then I'm going to put my top on, and you're going to notice something when I put my top on. I've got some marks on it. Okay, and I will explain those. So let's take a look at our finished design. Okay, here is our little design here. So you can see that I have rickrack here in 3 places. And this is totally up to you how you do this. This is just how I did this particular one. I quite like it. I've got the trim there, the rickrack, and then I've used some decorative stitches. This one and this one are the same, and this one's a little bit different. They could have all been the same. They could have all been different, whatever you want to do. And I've actually stitched those on using my sewing machine. All right, so because when I go to the sewing machine, it can be a little difficult to, keep a nice round line of stitching, I used my soap to just draw on a bit of a guideline. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it gives me an idea of where I can do that stitching. Now, before we get to the stitching though, and by the way, because this is wool and batting and everything, I don't need to baste it. It just stays together quite well. It's not a very big piece, so that worked out just fine. The other thing you want to do is get your hanging tab in there. So I folded the ribbon in half. I'm just going to put it here. You may want to use a little bit of glue to hold that in place so you can get it exactly where you want it. That's where your Aleene's Tacky Glue comes in, or you might want to use Elmer's glue stick, the school glue stick. That works fine as well. So you want to just get that in there. And then the next step is to go to the sewing machine and start doing some stitching. So we're going to want to do a straight stitch all around the edges here to keep all 3 layers together. And then we're going to do some decorative stitches here as well to keep it together even better and to look pretty, right? And then we're going to come back to the cutting table here and we're going to add that rickrack. All right, so let me get to the sewing machine. I'll show you what I'm going to work with, what decorative stitches I'm going to work with, and the adjustments I made to them. Now it's time to do some stitching. So I'm at the sewing machine and I've got my machine set up. I'm using the Janome M7. I've got it set up with the HP 2-foot and the HP needle plate. So I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 inch seam around the outside of this decoration. Now, before I get into that though, I just wanted to mention one thing. So if you've been following me for some time, you may have noticed something different underneath my videos, and that's a little heart with a $sign inside. And that is your opportunity to support Chatterbox Quilts and my YouTube channel. So what that is that for as little as $2, you can contribute to help me buy the items I need to produce these free videos for you. And if you would care to support me in that method, I would truly appreciate it. So before I start sewing, on come the glasses, because if I can't see, I can't sew. And I'm going to start somewhere, it doesn't matter where you start, somewhere down near the bottom here. And I'm just using a straight stitch. I've actually increased my stitch length to 3. I'm just going to start here. We're going to put the foot down, and I'm just going to bring up my thread here just to make sure nothing gets caught up there. And I'm not going to lock my stitches because I'm going to come right back to this area and lock them at the end. All right, so I'm just going to take it slowly as I go along because I want to try and keep that 1/4 inch away from the edge. You could do even a 1/2 inch if you wanted to, totally up to you. And I know here that I'm not exactly, my top part is a little bit hanging over, so keep that in mind. Okay, so when I come up to the edges, I'm going a little bit more than a 1/4 inch because they may not be exactly lined up properly. So I just want to make sure I catch all 3 layers here when I'm stitching. Again, using a 1/2 inch might help more in that situation. Not a perfect 1/4 inch seam, but that's okay. So you notice I've got my ribbon in the top there. I've got it down in far enough so that I know that the stitching is going to catch it as well. So you can really feel those 3 layers there. So I know I can't really feel my batting too. I guess maybe one more stitch, but there we go. And we're almost back to the beginning here. And I'm just going to back stitch. Make sure we have locked those stitches in. All right, so here's what it's looking like. I'm just going to cut off these initial thread tails. So there we go. So that is all together now. Let me make sure my ribbon's in there. Okay, whew. Now you can always flip it over on the back and make sure everything's all caught here as well. So it's all looking good. Perfect. All right. Now it's time to do some fun stitching. That's a decorative stitching. So I need to change things out here because you need to make sure you've got that zigzag or regular needle plate in anytime you work with the decorative stitches. So I'm going to do that. I'm also going to change my thread because I want to use that nice gold thread, and then I'll show you what decorative stitches I'm going to use on this project. So now that I've got everything stitched together, it's the fun part, which is using the decorative stitches. So on the Janome M7, I'm working with stitch D58, so that's decorative stitch 58, and I've actually changed the length of it stays the same at 2.5, but I've changed the width to 7 for the top area here. I'm going to adjust the widths of these different stitches as I go down because they're working on bigger parts, so they should be a little wider, I think. Seems to work well. It worked well in the sample I used, so I'm going to do that as well. I've also marked just with the soap, just on the stitching line, the straight stitching line, because I find that's a little easier to tell me, like sometimes it's a little hard to see with the foot. I actually have the F2 foot on here, so it's fairly open, but just to make sure I know where I want to start, I want to start where that straight stitch, that edge stitching is. So I'm going to put this underneath my needle here. We're going to get started there. And I've got those drawn lines as guidance, so I'm going to line up the mark on my F2 foot, that center mark, with that line. That should work okay. Let's see what happens. And we're going to take it not too fast because we are working with decorative stitches. Okay, I'm coming near the end here, so I'll make sure I'm going to stop this over there, approximately there. All right, so I'll make sure it finishes. That's where it finishes off its stitch, actually. So it will finish where it wants to finish, but I want to make sure it's close to that edge. And I can just trim off my thread. So that's the first one I'm doing. I've got 2 more rows to do, and I actually do want to switch up the stitches. Now, the second one, I'm going to do a different stitch. I'm going to try let's see, D72, and I'm going to make that 8 inches, not 8 inches, 8 millimeters wide. Oh my goodness, 8 inches would be a little much, wouldn't it? But I want to use this same stitch down at the bottom here, and I want to use it at the width of 9 millimeters, which is as wide as it'll go. So because I've got this stitch already set up, I'm going to do that one now, and then I'll come back and do this other one. So I'm just going to do the same thing, just start at the edge and go across with that little bit wider decorative stitch, and then I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so there we have the two D58 stitches at the 7 millimeters here and at the 9 here, which is the default on that particular stitch. Looking pretty good so far. Now I need to fill in with another stitch in the center here, and that's going to be at 8 millimeters, and that's going to be D72. So let me just get to that one and do the same thing all the way across. And after that's done, that's it for the stitching on this particular project, but we still have some trim to apply. So let me just stitch this decorative stitch on here, and I can show you what it looks like, and then we can move on to finishing up this particular decoration. Okay, so we've got all the decorative stitching on there. I think it looks pretty good, and I'm certainly glad that I drew some lines on for guidance, because otherwise I might be like all over the place. So next thing I need to do is to add some rickrack or some trim. I'm using rickrack, but you could use whatever you wanted, onto this decoration. So I'm going to go back to the cutting table and show you how I do that. Now it's time to add some trim, and I'm going to be using this nice metallic gold rickrack. And I haven't drawn any lines on here. I probably can just, eyeball it, but you certainly could draw some guidelines if you wanted to for your trim. What I do want to do is I want to fold my rickrack underneath before I glue it down. So I'm going to cut some, probably a little bit extra, and I'll trim it down here in a minute, but I do want to make sure that I put this under to finish those edges. So I could put it here, about there, and I'm going to have it go about here, and so I can cut over about there, I think. All right, so I'm using some of this Aleene's glue, which I haven't used for a while, so let's hope it works. And then I can get it to come out. There we go. So I'm just going from the straight stitch along, and actually you could just do some little dots of this, and that will, once I get it to come down. Here's my exercise during this project. Okay, here we go. So there's a little bit there, and so we can kind of just put some little dots down in that kind of curved shape, and that will definitely guide my trim. All right. This is kind of the mucky part of the project, if you will, because I didn't have any muckiness with the stitches, but I do with this. So, and of course with the rickrack, it's not necessarily gonna fit, as you can see here. This dries clear, so I'm not worried about it. And then on this side, I'm actually going to cut a little more off. It's kind of thick. You really don't want too much underneath if you don't have to. So sort of like this. So I'm not going to hold this right now because I want to get on with the rest of them, but it needs to be held down a bit. You could put a little bit of parchment paper over the top and set it with an iron. That would help as well. So let's go on, and I'm going to add some more here. So I'm just going to add more trim here, and I'm going to add more trim down here as well, and then I'll show you what that looks like after I've glued it all down. So now I've got the rickrack all done, and it's on. I actually did put some parchment paper over and just pressed it a little bit to keep it on there to get that glue to set. And now the only other thing to do is to pink the edges. Now you don't have to do this, but I think it adds some extra interest to the project. So you want to make sure that you're cutting with the pinking shears close to but not through that straight stitching that you did. So you can just go along and trim it all the way along. And then when you are done, you will have a finished Christmas tree decoration that will look like this. So I'll just move this out of the way. And the only thing you need to be careful of when you're using those pinking shears is when you get to the top. So you just want to cut up the top, and then I just did the top here and then the batting and the backing separately so that I wouldn't cut through that hanging loop. So just need to be a little careful there. But otherwise you just cut all around it, and then you've got this really nice Christmas tree decoration to hang up. And while you don't have rickrack on the back, you could put it on if you wanted to make it two-sided, because you will see those decorative stitches through. I decided not to, just to do it on one side, but you certainly could add that trim to the other side as well. So remember, if you want to get the Easy Peasy Christmas, well, it's not Christmas, the Easy Peasy tree set, I call it a Christmas tree because that's what I'm making, but the Easy Peasy tree set from Martelli, check in the description below the video because I'll have a link for it there. And remember, there are 2 sizes of trees in that set, and you can make something like this, or you can make the stuffed 3-dimensional trees for not just Christmas, but maybe Halloween or Easter or whatever fabric you want to use in them. Thanks so much for watching today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Be sure to share it with your quilting friends. And remember to subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified the next time I release a new video. Now, before you go, check out these other videos I've included just for you. And for more helpful quilting information, be sure you go to my website at www.chatterboxquilts.com.